They burned my shed. Yeah, not metaphorically, not some HOA letter, not a warning taped to the door. I mean actual fire, flames licking through wood that had been standing longer than most of their luxury condos had even been imagined. And the wild part? They didn't even think it mattered. I smelled it before I saw it. That sharp, chemical kind of smoke that doesn't belong in a quiet morning. It was just past dawn, one of those pale, washed-out skies where everything feels still, like the world hasn't decided what kind of day it wants to be yet. I stepped out onto my back porch with a mug of coffee, half awake, and there it was, a thin gray ribbon climbing up from behind the hill at the edge of my property. At first, I thought, okay, somebody's burning trash, happens out here sometimes. But then the wind shifted, just slightly, and it hit me. Wrong smell, wrong direction, wrong everything. My stomach dropped before my brain even caught up. I didn't think, I just moved. I ran, boots hitting gravel, slipping, catching myself on the fence post as I cut across the backfield. That shed wasn't just storage, not to me. It was where everything lived that didn't fit inside the house. Tools I'd inherited from my dad, old lumber stacked from projects I never quite finished, boxes of things he refused to throw away because you never know when you'll need it. By the time I reached the clearing, it was already gone. Not damaged, not partially burned, gone. The kind of gone where you stand there, and your brain tries to reconstruct what used to be there because it can't accept what it's seeing. Blackened beams collapsed inward like ribs crushed under weight. The tin roof twisted and curled like it had tried to escape the fire and failed. Ash floated through the air in slow, lazy flakes, like snow that didn't belong in this season or this life. And then I saw them. A group of men standing just beyond the edge of the charred ground, clean boots, branded jackets, the kind of posture that says they're not surprised by what just happened because they planned it. They weren't looking at the shed. They were looking past it, up toward the ridge. And that's when it clicked. Up on that ridge sat a brand new development, glass-heavy, expensive, the kind of place where people pay extra for words like panoramic view and unobstructed skyline. My shed had been the obstruction. One of the guys noticed me standing there, probably covered in ash, breathing harder than I realized. He walked over, calm, rehearsed, like he'd said this before. Controlled removal, he said, hands slightly raised like he was diffusing something. Part of site optimization. We assumed the structure was abandoned. I just stared at him. Abandoned. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it didn't fit inside my head properly. I had been in that shed the night before, fixing a rusted hinge on the side door, listening to an old radio that barely held a signal. There was nothing abandoned about it. You assumed, I said, and even to me my voice sounded quieter than it should have been. He shrugged, like it was paperwork, like it was nothing. No activity observed. No registered utilities. It happens. It happens. That's the thing about people like that. They don't break rules because they think they're above them. They break rules because they've convinced themselves the rules don't apply to things that don't matter. And to them, I didn't matter. My land didn't matter. That shed? Just clutter in the way of a better view. They hadn't called. They hadn't checked records. They hadn't knocked on my door, even though you could literally see my house from where they were standing. They just decided. And that was it. I didn't yell. I didn't swing. I didn't do anything dramatic like you'd expect in a moment like that. I just stood there, watching the last pieces of smoke drift upward, feeling this slow, steady kind of anger settle in, the kind that doesn't explode right away, the kind that waits. That night, I went back out there. No rush this time. No panic, just quiet. The stars were out, clear and sharp, and up on the ridge those apartment buildings glowed. Every balcony lit up like a trophy case. You could see exactly what they were selling, that view, that clean line across the horizon, nothing blocking it anymore. They got what they wanted. And standing there in the middle of what used to be mine, I realized something. People like that don't think about consequences the same way the rest of us do. They think in timelines, in profits, in what's the fastest way to get from here to there. They don't think about the small things, the overlooked details, the stuff that doesn't seem important until suddenly it is. And that's when something clicked in my head, not anger, not exactly. More like memory. Years ago, my uncle, guy spent half his life dealing with land disputes, permits, zoning headaches, once told me, big projects don't fall apart because of big mistakes, they fall apart because of one small thing nobody thought would matter. I stood there, looking at the empty space where my shed used to be, and for the first time since that morning, I smiled. Not because I was over it, because I wasn't. And I had a feeling they had just made a mistake they couldn't see yet. Now let me pause the story for a second, because what happened here? It's not just some random act of arrogance. It actually follows a very predictable pattern. According to standard procedure, any active construction project, especially something as large as a multi-unit residential development, has layers of compliance tied to its permits. We're talking environmental impact, fire safety buffers, existing structure documentation, all of it. And here's the key part most people don't realize. Those insignificant structures, sheds, barns, even old fences sometimes, they're often logged in the original site survey. Once they're logged, they're not just objects anymore, they're conditions. From a legal perspective, removing something like that without proper reassessment isn't just demolition. It can trigger a chain reaction. You're no longer compliant with the conditions under which your permit was approved. And once that happens, inspectors don't just look at that one issue, they start looking at everything. And psychologically, this is where developers fall into what I call a blind spot bias. This is a psychological trap. When you're operating at scale, you start filtering out anything that feels small. You stop seeing individuals, you see obstacles, variables, inconveniences. That shed wasn't just wood and nails. It was leverage. They just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I didn't waste time being angry. Anger feels good for about 10 minutes, maybe 15 if you really lean into it. But after that, it just burns energy you're going to need later. What I needed wasn't a reaction, it was a plan. So I went inside, grabbed an old folder from the bottom drawer in my office. One of those thick, overstuffed ones with papers you keep just in case. Turns out, just in case had finally shown up. Inside were old land surveys, property boundary documents, and buried somewhere in there, a copy of the original site documentation from when that development first got approved. I didn't even fully remember why I had it. Probably something my uncle insisted on years back, one of those trust me, you'll want this someday moments. Yeah, he was right. I spread everything out on the kitchen table, coffee going cold next to me, and started reading, slowly at first, then faster as things started connecting. There it was, my shed, not as a footnote, not as an afterthought, but clearly marked in the original survey, listed as an existing rural structure, and more importantly, tied to a compliance condition, fire safety buffer, preservation until reassessment. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at that page for a second, letting it sink in. Because now, this wasn't about a shed anymore. This was about a violation, and not the kind you fix with an apology and a check. So I got in my truck and drove straight into town. Municipal office wasn't anything fancy, beige walls, fluorescent lighting, the kind of place where time moves slower just out of principle. I walked up to the counter, set the folder down, and said, I need to file a report. The clerk looked at me like he'd heard that sentence 1,000 times, but as I started laying out the documents, that look changed. Unauthorized demolition, unreported fire, violation of environmental compliance conditions. Each page I slid across the counter felt heavier than the last. He didn't say much, just nodded, flipped through, made copies. But I could see it that shift. The moment it stopped being some guy complaining and started becoming something we actually have to deal with. Within a couple days, the first notice went out, then another, and then the one that matters. Stop work order. You ever seen a construction site freeze? It's weird. These places are usually all noise and motion, machines moving, people shouting, constant activity. But when that order hits, it's like someone pulls the plug. Cranes stop mid-air, equipment goes silent. Workers just kind of stand around looking at each other like they missed a meeting nobody told them about. That's exactly what happened up on that ridge. I drove by a few days later, just to see it for myself, and there it was. Stillness. The kind that doesn't belong on a place built around momentum. Sales office. Closed. Glass doors locked. And you could already feel it spreading, not just on-site, but outward. Buyers who had already put down deposits started asking questions. Investors started making calls. Because when something like this happens, it doesn't stay contained. It leaks. Weeks went by, then months. And during that time, inspectors went through everything. Not just the shed incident. Everything. Permits. Approvals. Material changes. Safety plans. And here's the thing about people who cut corners. They rarely cut just one. Missing fire exits, improper drainage systems, unapproved substitutions in building materials. Little things, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but together, it adds up, fast. And right at the center of it all was that fire. That one decision to burn something they thought didn't matter became the thread that unraveled everything. I didn't have to push anymore. The system did it for me. That's something people misunderstand about situations like this. They think revenge means going out and doing something dramatic, something loud. But the real kind, the kind that lasts, it's quiet. It's paperwork. It's patience. Eventually, they showed up. Not the construction crew this time. Not the guy with the controlled removal speech. No, this was different. Black SUVs, clean shoes, people who looked like they spent more time in conference rooms than on job sites. Legal team. They came to my property like they were approaching something fragile. Which, in a way, they were. I was out front when they pulled up. Didn't invite them in. Didn't offer coffee. Just stood there and waited. One of them stepped forward, gave me that professional smile. The kind that's supposed to feel reassuring, but mostly just feels practiced. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we'd like to resolve this situation." Resolve. That's a nice word for, this is costing us more money every day. They started talking, carefully at first, then faster as they realized I wasn't interrupting. Compensation for the loss. Reconstruction of the shed. Landscaping improvements. Even threw in some vague language about restoring goodwill. I let them go on. There's power in silence. People hate it. They'll fill it with whatever they think you want to hear. And when they finally ran out of words, I spoke. "I'm not interested in goodwill," I said. "I'm interested in correction." That smile tightened just a little. So I laid it out. Full replacement of the structure. Not just rebuilt, but upgraded. Fire-resistant materials. Proper documentation. Inspected and approved. Financial damages. Not just for the structure, but for what they destroyed inside it. And this part? This was the one that mattered most. Written acknowledgement, filed and attached to every future planning document related to that development, stating that my property and any structures on it were protected and required explicit verification before any action could be taken. No assumptions. No shortcuts. No, we thought it was abandoned. They looked at each other. You could see it, the calculation happening in real time. What it would cost to fight this. How long it would take. What the delays were already doing to them. And then they nodded. Just like that. All that confidence, all that control they had when they first burned that shed gone. Replaced with urgency. Compliance. They agreed. Not because they wanted to. Because they had to. It took some time after that. Permits to adjust, inspections to pass, paperwork to finalize. But eventually, construction resumed. Carefully this time. Slower. More respectful. And down on my land, a new shed went up. Stronger. Fireproof. Documented in ways the old one never was. I stood there the day it was finished, running my hand along the side of it, feeling that smooth, solid surface, and I thought about that morning again. The smoke. The ash. The way they stood there like it didn't matter. Funny thing is, they were right about one part. The shed itself? Yeah, it didn't matter. What mattered was what it represented. Boundaries. Respect. And the fact that sometimes the smallest thing in the way is the one thing holding everything together. So yeah, that's the story. And if you're sitting there thinking, man, that's satisfying. Yeah, it is. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. There's something deeply human about watching someone who thought they could bulldoze their way through everything suddenly realize they missed something small that changes the whole game. But here's the part most people miss. This wasn't really about revenge. It looked like revenge on the surface. Sure, guy gets his shed burned down, turns around and shuts down a multi-million-dollar project. Sounds like a movie. But if you zoom out a little, this was about leverage. And more importantly, understanding where leverage actually comes from. The lesson here is, power doesn't always sit where it looks like it does. Those developers had money, lawyers, influence, timelines, all the visible stuff. And I had what? A patch of land, an old shed, and a folder full of papers I barely remembered keeping. On paper, that's not a fair fight. Not even close. But here's the twist. Systems are built on rules. And rules don't care how big you are. They care whether you followed them. From a legal perspective, what saved me wasn't luck. It was documentation. It was the fact that somewhere, at some point, Someone wrote something down and filed it properly. That shed existed in the system. And once something exists in the system, removing it without going through the process creates a ripple effect. That's the part people underestimate. They think rules are obstacles. In reality, rules are tools. And if you know how to use them, you don't have to be louder, richer, or more aggressive than the other side. You just have to be right and patient. Now let's talk about the human side of it for a second. Because what those guys did, it wasn't just a legal mistake. It was a mindset problem. This is a psychological trap. When people operate at scale, they start categorizing everything. Important versus unimportant. Valuable versus disposable. And once something gets labeled insignificant, it stops being treated with care. That's how you end up with decisions like burning down someone's structure without checking ownership. Not because they're cartoon villains, but because they've trained themselves to stop seeing individuals. And that's dangerous. Because the moment you stop seeing the individual, you stop seeing the consequences tied to them. And sooner or later, those consequences show up anyway. The lesson here is, never assume something is too small to matter. That applies both ways, by the way. If you're the one being overlooked, don't underestimate your position just because it doesn't look powerful. Sometimes your strength isn't obvious until someone pushes against it. And if you're on the other side, if you're the one making decisions, building things, managing projects, don't cut corners on the small stuff. That's usually where the biggest risks are hiding. I've seen people lose entire deals over missing signatures, delay projects for months because of one overlooked requirement. Not because they didn't know better, but because they thought it wouldn't matter. It always matters. And maybe the most important part of all this, I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I slowed down. While they were moving fast, trying to optimize, trying to push forward, I stopped, looked back, and asked one simple question. What did they miss? That question changes everything. Because once you find that gap, you don't need to force anything. The system does the work for you. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in that situation, your property gets damaged, ignored, brushed off like it doesn't matter. Would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have gone for something more immediate? And on the flip side, have you ever been in a position where you overlooked something small, only to realize later it wasn't small at all? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd expect, probably more than I should. And hey, if you like stories like this, real situations, real consequences, and the kind of lessons you don't usually hear until it's too late, hit that like button, subscribe, stick around. Because trust me, this kind of thing, it happens more often than people think.